about, that families worry about for their kids, especially early on, especially when they're new to a diagnosis or wondering about a diagnosis. So I can see we have a lot of great questions, a lot of great ideas. And so I have some content to work through here today. I'm hoping that I can move through some of it more quickly. A lot of the topics that we've already been talking about tie in really nicely. So we can maybe focus on some of these questions that have already come up. Next slide, please. So I just really wanted to very briefly touch on just the scope of what speech language pathologists do, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But one topic that I think is important to highlight the difference in is the difference between speech and language. I think sometimes we use these words interchangeably, but we're really referring to two different things. And basically, speech has to do with the actual sound of the message. Language has to do with the content of the message. Autistic kids can have difficulties in any area of speech or language, but we are most commonly focused on supporting a child's language skills rather than their speech skills. So often, it's not so much that a child has physical difficulty producing speech, articulating sounds, it's that they might have difficulty using language functionally and interactively. And I think Raj in that case was a perfect example of a child who's very capable of saying words, but he's having a hard time using words interactively or communicatively. Just want to make sure everybody's on mute just so we can easily hear each other. Since we don't have too much time today, if we can just have one click here, whoever's just advancing the slides, thanks so much. We're going to be mostly focused on expressive communication, and that's what everybody is really excited to talk about today. Next slide. If you think about how you're expressing yourself every day, you're talking, you're texting, you're emailing, you're using gestures, that communication is serving a lot of different purposes. Some of them have to do with like requesting, telling people what you want and need. But most of the time when you're communicating, it's not to just tell somebody what you want. It's for a much more nuanced, social, dynamic reason. And often autistic kids can have difficulty using communication for any number of functions. We often start by helping them learn how to request, how to tell people what they want and need. And that makes sense. It's very powerful. It helps a child gain control over their environment. But as we're supporting communication, we also want to make sure there's a lot of other reasons why we communicate, a lot of other functions of communication. So we want to make sure we're supporting all those other reasons why a child might be communicating beyond requesting so that they can be independent and effective communicators. Next slide, click. So if we're thinking about how you can support your child's communication, we want the family to be as involved as they can, and we have a bunch of really engaged, actively involved family members here today. That's amazing. We want to think about how you can incorporate strategies kind of within daily routines. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We want to ensure that there's consistency across settings and people. So everyone that interacts with the child has like kind of a consistent expectation or a thing that we're supporting for them. And we want to look for natural opportunities for communication. So we don't necessarily want to contrive communication, force or demand communication. We want communication to be fun, and we want it to be a positive experience, and we want it to happen naturally. So we can think creatively about how to make that happen. Next slide. So to support communication, we first need to make sure that we support a child's sensory and emotional regulation. This helps us lay the groundwork for connection and for communication. And we also want to incorporate what a child is interested in. And so sometimes we do need to use that creativity to think about what sparks joy for a child, and then figure out how we can find other activities that are similar to that, and then use those interests to encourage communication that's meaningful. So I feel like all of us on the call today can think of a child who has autism or might have autism who has an interest, something that they really love doing. Sometimes it could be something that's a little bit unexpected or unusual for their age. So, I met a child who was 7, and the thing that he loved the most in the world was learning about the presidents of the United States. So if I was working with that child, I'd want to lean into that interest, find as many activities as we can, books to read, videos to read, to watch, ways for me to learn about presidents so I can keep up with him. How can we lean into that interest to shape that connection and those opportunities for communication? Maybe there's a child who you notice really likes to watch things out of the corner of his eye. So that would make you wonder if maybe they're really interested, they get a lot of joy out of visual input. So maybe you're thinking about other activities that also involve a lot of visual input. Maybe a child might like watching bubbles fall in the air, or they might like watching something spin or watching something in a mirror. So maybe we can think about activities that have that kind of interest in them, but also shape more opportunities to encourage communication. All of us learn best when we are calm and when we're happy and when we're doing something that we really, really love. And that certainly is the same for kids who are learning communication. We want to use those interests. Next slide. So thinking a little bit more about how we might use those interests, especially of a child who's an earlier communicator, just starting to speak or use other communication. We talk a lot about following a child's lead. And really what we mean by that is paying attention to what they're doing, what they're interested in, what they're looking at, and then engaging in that right along with them. So that's usually a better strategy than redirecting them to something that they're not already engaged in, something that's more adult-led. So we really just want to do what they're doing, talk about what they're doing, talk about what's going on as it's happening, and then try to expand just a little bit beyond what they're doing on their own. So if they're not using words yet, we're maybe just modeling one word at a time. Or if they're starting to use words, maybe we're starting to model 2 or 3 words together. So if this child says ball, maybe we say, it's a yellow ball, let's kick the ball, it's rolling, just moving just a little bit beyond what that child is already doing spontaneously. And just in general, we want to think about modeling language without an expectation that a child is going to repeat what you're saying. So for this child here on the top, we're kind of very much watching her communication, and she's clearly communicating something non-verbally. She clearly wants the cookie. So you might just model for her, I'm hungry. The child on the bottom here, clearly upset, clearly not liking what's going on. So we model the language, I don't like it. This kind of modeling is a little bit nuanced because we want to model communication. We don't necessarily want to withhold something until a child communicates for it. We don't want to force a child to request something. We just want to seek on those natural opportunities, pounce on them, and then keep it moving, keep it positive. And this is a strategy that we can use no matter what form of communication a child is using. And so if we can just have one click here, it's another little picture. So, this is an example of a child that's using a communication device, which we're already been talking about this afternoon, and I'm going to talk about more in a minute. But even if a child is communicating in a way other than speech, we can also use this same strategy of modeling for them, model on their system how to communicate. So it might be signs, it might be pictures, it might be a tablet, but we can model using that as we're communicating with them. Another tip to keep in mind is try to avoid quizzing. So if you can think about, the last time you had a job interview, or you really felt like someone was grilling you about something, it's a really stressful to have a ton of questions directed at you. And that's even more true if you're getting quizzed on something that you're still learning how to do. So we try to focus on using comments more than questions, modeling, describing, talking about what's going on, rather than asking them to label something, rather than asking them to say something, or rather than asking them a question about what's going on. Because that just generally places a lot of pressure on a child to speak, which is something we want to try to avoid. This is a topic that was also introduced in our case today, and that is the use of echolalia. It's a pretty common feature of the language of autistic kids, and it just has to do with repeating words that someone else says. So just like in our case today, you might have immediate echolalia where you're kind of immediately repeating back something. So you ask a child, do you want juice? And they say, want juice. That's immediate echolalia. Do you want the cookie or the cracker? And they say cracker. Even if they mean the cookie, that might be echolalia. You can also think about delayed echolalia. We often refer to that as scripting, where a child is repeating something that they've heard in the past. It might be repeating something from a video. It might be repeating something from a previous interaction. Both of these kind of like features of communication are a clue that a child is learning language in a different way than maybe the way that you or I learned language. So they're learning whole chunks of language rather than learning individual words. And our goal is for them to learn how to break down that language and put their own sentences together. And something that we're learning more and more is this kind of repetitive language usually serves some purpose. So you might use a script to communicate something. You might use scripting to kind of help regulate yourself if you're feeling stressed out. You might repeat something because you're not sure what to say or you're not understanding a question. With the example of Raj in the case, I would wonder if that immediate echolalia had to do with him maybe having difficulty understanding a question or direction and kind of immediately kind of parroting it back. Sometimes the purpose of a script is not immediately clear, and we have to be a little bit of a detective to figure out what the reason for the scripting or the repetitive language is. It's definitely not something that we need to ignore. It usually is serving a purpose, and we can acknowledge it and expand on it. I see there's a question in the chat about if echolalia and scripting are synonyms. So I would say that scripting is a type of echolalia. So echolalia can be immediate or it can be delayed. I would say that delayed echolalia and scripting are synonyms, if that's helpful. Okay, we are going to quickly touch on a few different things. General other strategies to support communication. We all know that using books can be really valuable for a child's language development, but we also might have had the experience that an autistic child or a young child who maybe has difficulty with kind of engagement and attention might have a hard time sitting and listening to a whole book. The good news is we don't have to sit a kid down and read a whole book to them. We can think about how to start small, keep the interaction quick and positive. Maybe the child's just flipping through the pages while you talk about what they're reading. There's some books that are very repetitive, so you could see if a child could kind of like fill in a word as they get kind of familiar with the book, if it's kind of like repetitive language within the book. If we go to the next slide, kind of a related concept is the idea of kind of creating familiar repetitive routines with a child, where it has like a similar idea that you can kind of like create a familiar routine and then you can hesitate, expand on it, build on it, mix up the routine, and those kinds of things give a lot of opportunities for communication. And that's something that can happen in activities that are happening in your day-to-day life already. So here's a good example of getting dressed. So maybe as this child and her parent were getting dressed, the parent is using repetitive language. Shirt on, pants on, socks on, shoes on, and then maybe it gets to a point where you can kind of hesitate. Jacket on. Maybe the child then fills in that word. Then maybe after you get used to that routine, you can start to mix it up or change it or do something unexpected or silly. That kind of unexpected behavior can also really elicit communication. If something goofy or unexpected happens, everybody has like a nice social moment together, and maybe that elicits a little bit more communication out of a child. Next slide. This is another example of a routine that may be for a child that's really interested in gross motor play, sensory-based play, kind of roughhousing. Maybe this is a child that loves to get lifted up in the air. You use kind of a repetitive phrase. Then you can kind of hesitate to see if they'll fill in the word. And then maybe you mix it up after a while, where instead of lifting them up, you flip them upside down. That's kind of a goofy thing. See if it elicits any communication out of the child. So again, just the idea of finding things that the child is gravitating towards and is interested in, and then making them a little bit repetitive and routined. And then you can start to elicit communication within those kinds of activities. Okay, so we have been talking a lot about supporting expressive language. Just to briefly touch on supporting receptive language, which is understanding of language. We often think about using visual supports to help a child understand verbal information. So often, children on the autism spectrum have a strength in their visual skills. So if they're struggling to understand verbal information, maybe we can incorporate more visuals, which is also something that came up during our case today. There's just a few examples of visual tools here on this slide. And this is just like a brief teaser and introduction because one of our future ECHO programs, I think went over this summer, we'll have much more in-depth information about how to implement visual supports for your child. There's lots of different reasons we would implement visuals, but often it has to do with supporting comprehension of information. I think I might skip. Can we just skip a couple slides here? I want to make sure we have plenty of time. And so these slides are going to be available to you. General ideas of how to incorporate some of these strategies we've been talking about within activities that you're already doing. So the goal is not to add a bunch of work to your day, add new activities or homework to what you're already doing as very busy caregivers. But thinking about how to elicit language, how to model language, how to support comprehension of language within routines that are happening already. So maybe you can be thinking about other routines or other activities and how you might use similar techniques within those activities that are happening within your family. Okay, so I wanted to make sure I rushed through some of that stuff to make sure that we have some good time to talk about augmentative and alternative communication. So if a child is not speaking much, or if they have trouble speaking, if their speech is not very clear, if it's difficult to understand, or if they're speaking inconsistently, so if they're speaking in some contexts but not others, we will often explore augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. And that can take a lot of different forms. All of us use AAC. We use AAC when we use gestures. We use AAC when we type, when we write, when we pass a note to someone. So some forms of AAC don't involve any technology at all. So like a picture-based system, a communication board, using sign language. In this context, we would consider that probably to be a form of AAC. That came up in our case as well. And then there's also other forms of AAC that involve different levels of technology. So on the right side of the slide here, we have tablet-based systems or dedicated speech-generating devices. So these are devices where you push a button and it says a word. And these types of higher tech devices have very complex abilities for communication. So they have thousands of vocabulary words. They have the ability to generate grammar. They have the ability to put words together into sentences. So AAC, I think often when people think of AAC, they think of the things on the right side of the slide here, but AAC encompasses many other forms of communication. So we know that using AAC can be extremely beneficial for people with different types of disabilities, including autism. And that even goes for people who have emerging verbal communication skills. So even for kids who are starting to talk a little bit, AAC can be really valuable. AAC builds on that strength in visual skills. It promotes independence. So for a child that's really good at labeling things, really good at repeating things, but might have a harder time spontaneously communicating to tell us what they want and need, AAC might be something that we would consider implementing. And I think the most important thing is that AAC does not hinder speech development. So AAC does not hold a child back from speaking. It's a really, really common concern that we hear, that a child will become reliant on a form of AAC. It'll keep them from talking. We have a lot of good research in our field that shows that that's not the case. That's not something that we need to worry about. And in fact, for some kids, the opposite can actually be true. So for some kids, it actually supports speech development. So it can serve as kind of a bridge into spoken language, assist with that vocabulary growth, and most importantly, just give a child a way to communicate, eliminate frustration, a way for them to tell us what they want and need right now. I do want to note there's lots and lots and lots of types of AAC systems. The previous slide was really just a drop in the bucket. There's tons of different types of systems out there. There's also apps available. Not all of these systems, apps, programs are created equal. They all have different features. And we as speech language pathologists go through this process called feature matching, where we match the needs of our patient or client or student to the features of a system to find a system that's going to meet their needs right now and also moving forward. So we also have the ability sometimes to help a family identify funding sources or a way to obtain a permanent device for a child. Because these devices can be very expensive, but they're considered durable medical equipment. So I would really discourage you from going out and buying an app or buying a device for your child without the support of a speech language pathologist, just to make sure that we get the right fit. I know that a lot of us here on this call are on this call because you're waiting to get hooked into services. So with that being said, I did include a couple of free resources here as maybe just a starting point. I'm happy to talk more about that. There's an app here. There's a website that has kind of high quality communication boards available already. Sometimes it's nothing fancy. It's, you could print off some pictures off of Google Images to start having a child start to make choices, that kind of thing. But if we're thinking about longer term, more robust AAC, that's something that takes a little bit of expertise and nuance to get it right. Okay. So this is another thing that I'm glad that we have a chance to talk about. A few different myths here, or common misconceptions. And the one that I really wanted to highlight was the idea of speaking more than one language. That is, I don't think there's ever been a time that I have talked to a group of parents or caregivers that question hasn't come up. It's extremely common question and extremely common concern. A lot of people are concerned that exposing a child to multiple languages, bilingualism, multilingualism, will cause a language delay. But being exposed to multiple languages is not confusing to a child. Children throughout history have been learning more than one language at a time. And those kinds of multilingual or bilingual households are not going to cause a language delay. There's also a lot of research that shows that children with delays or disabilities like autism are more than capable of learning more than one language at a time. There doesn't need to be a worry that it's going to cause them to be confused. Being bilingual is an amazing thing. It's so valued in our society. Plus, it's really important for a child to be able to maintain connections with their family and with their culture. So it's really, really important that a family doesn't ever feel like they're being discouraged from speaking their primary language with their child, because we don't have to worry about it impacting their language development in a negative way. Okay, so I know that we went a little bit over time here. Next slide, I think we can go ahead and allow some time for questions. I really, really appreciate how engaged this group has been, and I would love to answer other questions, or if there's others on the call that want to chime in for answers